So yeah, I mean, in terms of what's happening, there is so much happening. It can sometimes, be difficult to know where to start. If we kind of look at, well, what's the kind of latest thing that happened from a people perspective, and an employer perspective, about 10 days ago, there was a really landmark ruling based on the Anti-Harassment Law. Now, the Anti-Harassment Law it's a public law. It's about public spaces and people being free of harassment, and women in particular. So it isn't specifically a labor law, but it has a section on employment. It says that employers should have policies to combat harassment and to deal with it in the workplace. And the significance of the decision is that for the first time in the kingdom, not only was was a man convicted and fined, he was also named. So he was publicly named and shamed. And so that's a landmark because, as we all know, when cases and when these decisions are made, there tends to be, they are announced, that they're not really, the people aren't named. It's sort of a little bit anonymous. But here, the perpetrator, the harasser, was actually named publicly and as a matter of record. So that's a really big message, that, you will be held, these things are taken seriously, and, people will be named and shamed. So it really raises the bar in this area. It also supports a lot of the stuff that the Ministry of HR has been doing. And I think one thing for everybody that's been going to the kingdom over the past, let's say, 5 years or so, the change in the position of women is just incredible to see. Not just in terms of working, but in terms of their rights being cascaded right down throughout the system, right down to, for example, now the way divorces and childcare and child custody are dealt with. It's just monumental. The change is incredible to see. So I think that's one thing I'd really highlight. And the other things in terms of the nitty-gritty, the ministry introduced this electronic authentication process for employment contracts. Now, it was always going to be introduced, but obviously COVID really accelerated digitization in 2020 and 2021. Now, it is operated through an electronic platform called Mudad, which ties into wages payments. It's linked to the General Organization for Social Insurance, GOSI, and the Ministry of HR. Now, the Ministry of HR initially had an intention that every employee would have an electronic contract in the system by the end of 2021. There have been a few issues with the system. And so certainly that is, it is still the intention that everybody gets onto this system, and that these contracts become the sort of main reference point and the operative contracts. But there have been some issues with the system. So I think one of the developments is that employers can still rely on their paper contracts, or what they're signing with their employees outside of this electronic process. So I think that's very useful and something that employers should know. Other things that have happened, the 14th of March 2021, I almost said this year, but of course we are now in 22. So in March 21, the Kingdom changed its visa regulations to enable non-worker categories to transfer their visas from one employer to the other, seemingly without the consent of the existing employer. So what in the UAE all those years ago used to be called the NOC. Now that did get introduced from the 14th of March. But during 2021, we got to understand a little bit more about how the system works and what this really means. Now, actually, it's not as easy as some of the publications would at first imply, which is that, if you're a foreign national, you've done at least 12 months of employment with your employer, you can resign and transfer your visa without your employer's consent. Now, actually, on the system, it's all done electronically. The new employer does have to cooperate with this process, and they still do have to give their agreement unless the employer has not paid wages for 2 months, or the visa has expired. So it's not quite what it was announced to be. So again, I think, you know, for people who are looking to recruit, or if they're going to release people, if people resign, that's quite an important administrative point in the way it works in practice.
Great, thank you. So, and I understand that there were, as you said, recent updates with the harassment law just now, but throughout 2021, we've seen a number of amendments come one after the other. So I know we will go into details and answer people's questions a bit later, but what about that very talked about HQ law? What do we know about it? I understand you've told me there are 44 companies that have announced they will move their headquarters. So what do we know a little bit more about it? Who will this apply to? And how do we imagine this will impact employers in the region?
Yeah, it's we are getting more and more details and a little bit more, I guess, of a framework of how it would work. Every year there is an investment conference that's organized by the Future Investment Institute, which is part of the PIF family. And in October, when it was held, the 44 companies announced that they would move their regional HQ there, and they signed memorandums of understanding with the Ministry of Investment. So Project HQ is being run by the Ministry of Investment and the Riyadh City Commission, so the Royal Commission for the City, and it's a joint program with the aim of attracting regional headquarters into the city, and as you say, specifically into the King Abdullah Financial District. Now, the Ministry of Investment has actually issued guidelines, so we have a lot more detail now than was available previously. The government does have this intention that from the 1st of January 2024, in order to be successful and to secure government contracts, the regional HQ will have to sit within the King Abdullah Financial District. What does this mean? Now, this does not mean that everybody will sit in this financial center. For those companies that do want to look at this move, what it means is having a core group of strategic people. So when it says regional HQ, the guidelines now make it clear that it means that this is the business unit that deals with strategic and managerial direction for the region. And the idea is to attract quite large companies. So the companies that would be eligible for this are companies which have at least 2 branches or subsidiaries together with their head office in their country where they've first established. And then the core people that would need to sit in this strategic unit are the kind of core people like your head of finance, your head of HR, your CFO, those kind of people. And under the memorandums of understanding, the idea is that this is very much like a regional HQ into which profits get get repatriated into, and the management for the region sits there. Now, I guess the one of the details that's quite useful to kind of break down is that for all of those companies that will want to do this, because there are some extremely lucrative contracts with the government, especially to achieve Vision 2030 and some of these Giga projects. If they set up their HQ in the King Abdullah Financial District, they get the benefit of these contracts. Now, they still have to have all of their operational staff and their actual day-to-day operations outside of the center. So they will not just be operating into the financial district. They will have a core body in the financial district, which will be exempt from tax, exempt from Saudisation, will be exempt from sort of restrictions on visas. And the people there would be able to sponsor their dependents and so on. But the day-to-day operations, these contracts, these large contracts that are going to be secured, will be operated by operations outside, which will still be subject to Saudisation, which will still be subject to corporate income tax, for example, which is at 15%. So the modeling is very interesting. Where you're going to move people, let's say typically from Dubai into Saudi, modeling of comp and ben. And part of the reason why this program has been put together is because the government would like to promote Riyadh as a global city, and they really want to increase the population of Riyadh, doubling, more than doubling. So, it's incredible. But what does that all mean for access to schooling, to hospitals, to housing? For expats who are looking to move into Riyadh, they would probably already tell you, availability of school places, availability of the kind of housing that they want to live in. It's all pretty tight at the moment. And so a lot of people may want to leave their families in Dubai. That's a very kind of typical thing that happens in this region, which is one of the reasons why the UAE, and Dubai was the first emirate, and it's now available on a federal level, introduced the remote working visa. So with the remote working visa, you could have your employer in Saudi and you yourself working in Saudi, but you are able to keep your family in Dubai. So it's interesting kind of how it all comes together.
Yeah, and it will be interesting to see the implications as well. I mean, it's always been the case with Saudi that the packages were a bit more generous in terms of leave, in terms of, trying to incentivize people relocating to Saudi Arabia, like it was the case with the UAE before they had so much to offer. But now it's a little bit more pressing, so to say, because if organizations are to move into Saudi, then they will have to look into this, and it won't be an option whether people want to work in Dubai or not. I find the modeling a little bit confusing. You were talking about, is it clearly laid out which part, because you said there needs to be a core group in the financial district, and then the rest of the operations and the broader workforce would be somewhere else where they would have to comply with Saudisation quotas, etc. Is it clearly outlined how many, which percentage of the people would be out and which could be in the financial district, or is it still something that's work in progress?
Yeah. So as far as I'm aware, there's no kind of percentage, but there are certain functions that must sit in the HQ. So, the strategic, the head of type function.
So to be clear, so when we say companies have to have their HQ in Saudi Arabia in order to get government contracts, that
Yes.
applies to all, does this apply to all sizes of companies and all types of companies?
So it is only available for companies that have at least 2 branches or 2 subsidiaries out in 2 different countries other than Saudi Arabia. So as a minimum, they're operating in 3 countries. 3 or 4 with their HQ, with their head office where they're established. Yeah. So we're talking about quite big companies.
Yeah, we not to name names, but we're talking primarily, I think, in those 44 companies about larger consultancy companies and larger engineering companies that are betting on those big projects and not need them.
Yeah. And it's not a surprise to see Deloitte, PwC, Siemens. I think Pepsi was also on there. So that's not a surprise.
Yeah, absolutely. And so to go back, and if anybody has further questions on this law in particular, because its implications are big, please do drop them in the chat. But meanwhile, we might move away. When do companies have to make that change by, Sarah?
Well, January 2024. But obviously, it'll have to be done, within the next 2 years in terms of modeling it out, figuring out what it means and what the requirements would be. But from January 24, according to what the government has announced, if you haven't got your HQ there, then you're not going to be eligible to bid for these government contracts. Now, there can always be exemptions that are made, but that's the announcement for now.
And you've mentioned so that the heads of the regional roles, the executive team should be, that's what makes a HQ a HQ. So it's not just a shallow office or not just a joint venture. Now, the rest of the operations and the rest of the team, do they have to be in Saudi, or could they be anywhere else so long as this core team is in the financial district?
So the rest of, yeah, they can be outside. So, you know, you
Okay.
can't prevent, and this is actually an important point. It does come back to some of the stuff that the Ministry of HR has tried to do with Saudizing certain functions. So remote customer service, for example, which was a tricky one, and a lot of people really grappled with it. And one of the things about it is actually Saudi Arabia is a member of the World Trade Organization. It cannot, well, I mean, it could, but it would be then potentially leaving itself exposed to a WTO claim. It can't prevent offshoring. So if you want to move the delivery of your service into another country, you know, under the rules of the WTO, you have the freedom to do that. So yes, you know, you can very much control in your own country what roles get Saudized and how they're delivered, but you can't prevent companies from deciding to offshore some of those services.
Yeah, absolutely. So to answer Manisha, who is asking again, so organizations that must comply with this HQ rule are organizations that have operations in more than 3 countries in the region, that
So
have
it's, well, I mean,
offices.
they're eligible for this program, and they only have to do it if they want to get government contracts.
Yeah, right. So hopefully that's clear. It's obviously not every organization. For many of us, we might have some contracts with government organizations, but is it worth doing the entire change? What portion of your revenue does it make up for, and of your business? And then there is no obligation as to how many people in your team must move, but it's the functions, the core functions, the HQ functions that must be based out of this office in Riyadh, even though it's, would you expect that there will be further regulations to incentivize the rest of the teams to move into Saudi? Because you were just saying one of the big goals is to increase the population in Riyadh. And let's be honest, if you've got 44 companies, bringing teams up to, you know, core teams wouldn't be huge. So do you imagine that after that's in place, or perhaps the next couple of years, we could see further regulations asking for more teams to move into the country?
Possibly, but I guess the incentive is you'll get, if you move the core team, you will then get you'll get the larger contracts. To service those contracts, you are then gonna, you know, have to up your operations. So I think the hope is that the two will feed off each other.
Yeah, I mean, then it depends what industry you're in, for sure.
Mm.
And when we say government contracts, we mean purely government, or do we also mean semi-government companies like, say, the likes of SABIC or Aramco, etc.?
Well, that is not entirely clear. Let me say that. I do not think it includes the likes of SABIC or Aramco, but some of the PIF companies, I don't know. I'm not sure. Probably not. Well, yeah, we'll have to see.
Good. All right. So we'll continue to take your questions further down the line if there is anything that you want to address. But you've talked about throughout the new changes. You've been mentioning Saudization a lot. We know that the country has been pushing Saudization in so many different ways. I think we've seen it over the past 10 years. And then, like you said, it became function specific. Where are we now? What are the updates with Saudization, and what you expect to be the main implications for employers?
Yeah, I mean, Saudization is a huge issue, and it is not going to go away, I would say. So from the 1st of December 2021, so we've had almost 2 months of this new system. So in December, the ministry launched this sort of Nitikat 2.0, and that really aggressively increases most businesses' Saudization quotas. Now, the system is quite useful now. That the new system, what it aims to do is it aims to do a forward trajectory. So employers, have a little bit of an algorithm. It's tied to specific headcount and is dependent on how many people you are employing. You put it into the logarithm, and then you more or less can predict, because the numbers always, you know, you crunch the numbers. It's never a pure science, but you would know for the next 3 years what your quota has to be. And I usually say to people, you need to be medium green to really, I think, be comfortable and to function. Because if all you do is just achieve minimum compliance and stay in low green, you're very vulnerable to yo-yoing up and down from low green to red every time somebody leaves or somebody joins. So yeah, so NITICAT has become more robust in terms of the quotas. And then the big thing is Saudisation of professions and functions. And that's really where the ministry has focused its attention over the last 2 years. And to give you an idea of it, I mean, we're talking about regulations about driving schools, cinemas, malls, cafes. It's like very granular. And largely what it does is it introduces a kind of de minimis Saudisation for certain functions. So, for example, with engineering, it'll say if you as a business employ 5 engineers, then 25% of them have to be Saudi nationals, and they should be paid minimum salaries. And that's the kind of way that that the Saudisation is working over the past couple of years. And the latest thing, which I think will affect most people, is Saudisation, and this is 100% Saudisation for clerical roles, administrative roles, and translators.
That is a tough one. So is there a percentage of Saudisation that's mandatory for the organization as a whole, or is it still for now function-based and role-based?
So it's both. So as a minimum, every organization will have a quota for the organization. And then there will be specific functions which either a percentage of the group of people carrying out that function have to be Saudi nationals, or it might be 100% Saudized. So yeah.
Where can organizations, because I don't think we could list all functions.
No, it's really impossible. There's no way.
Where can everybody find the list of, like the table with a list of roles and the percentages that are required?
Yeah, I'd keep an eye on the Ministry of HR website. And very often what they do is the ministry passes a regulation, and then the minister of HR will pass a regulation, and then the ministry will produce like a manual to explain what the regulation means and how to implement it. Now those should be available on the website, so you have to keep checking the ministry website. They are only published in Arabic, so you have to get them translated. There is an article on Clyde Co website which you might find useful. So I'll try and find it and put it in the chat.
Perfect. Yeah, I was just trying to find it on the Ministry of HR's website, and yes, it's in Arabic. So can't really find anything, but it will be more helpful than having to list every role like we're being asked right now. What are you seeing to be the impact on talent and recruitment in the kingdom at the moment? Because one can imagine that, yes, the kingdom is pushing the economic participation of women. We know there's always been a high rate of graduates that were women. So hopefully we have more talent that organizations can tap into, and it's been made easier to hire them. But are we seeing a talent shortage? Are we seeing that organizations are able to fill the gaps? I know until a couple of years ago, and I suppose now, we've heard a lot about fake Saudization, where organizations would hire a Saudi to fill a role, but then double the role with an expat, for example, who would then do the role because they couldn't find suitable people. So has this changed? What are you seeing in terms of talent?
There is a war for talent, I'd say. It is really hard to find people. When you do find good people, it's hard to retain them. So absolutely, there's a huge there's a huge war for talent, I'd say. And with Saudization, the difficult thing is, yes, you can you can find good people. They may be inexperienced, but you can train them up. It then just has to be a little bit of, unfortunately, a kind of reality that you'll lose, eventually you'll lose them because somebody will pay more. Probably PIF will pay more, and they would, it's just really hard to retain people. So again, the HR modeling that has to go into it of how to attract, how to retain, at least for like, the 5 years that you can get back your investment on the people. That kind of modeling is really, really important.
Yeah, it would be interesting, as someone says, agree on PIF, they always pay more. It would be interesting to hear from you, from key professionals in the room today, what your talent challenges are, and if you are happy to talk about your employee value proposition or anything that you've done to model your compensation structure in order to attract and retain Saudi talent. I think that would be something that the community would definitely benefit from. All right, we've also heard about proposed amendments to the law, Sarah. What are these about?
Yeah, so there was quite a wide range of proposed amendments published by the ministry in 2020, late 2020, and there was about 6 months of public consultation, which closed in February 21. Since then, I have to say we have not heard anything further about the amendments to the actual law in terms of when they will come into place and what will come into place, because very often we see the ministry adjusting according to the public consultation and some of the feedback they get. But I anticipate that this year we will probably have some amendments. There was some, one amendment would tie in to the changes from the 14th of March last year, this kind of ability even of a foreign national to resign employment and transfer. So one of the proposed amendments was to make it very clear. It sounds like a funny thing, but it was to make it very clear in the labour law that one of the reasons, legitimate reasons for termination of employment is employee resignation. So that's potentially, one thing that we could have a clarification. There has always been a debate about Article 77 and amending Article 77, because the criticism of it is that it allows employers to dismiss people too easily. Basically what Article 77 is, it's a clause that says that if the employer and employee have not agreed the compensation for invalid termination, the following formula will apply. And the formula is if it's a fixed term payment for the remainder of the term, or if it's an unlimited term, then 15 days pay, which is gross pay, for every year that the employee has served. Subject in both cases to a minimum of 2 months. So basically what, if employers have looked at their contracts properly, they will put an early termination clause, especially if it's a fixed term contract, which provides for terminate in the event of invalid termination, the employer will pay compensation of 2 months. So, the criticism of that, well, it just makes it very easy to dismiss people. And the answer is, well, yes, it does, provided that the employer has taken the time to draft their contracts properly. So we might see some amendment there. And generally, and I think another amendment was to increase maternity. So from 10 weeks to 14 weeks. So it would be the best in the GCC, which can only be a good thing. So yeah, little bits of kind of improving of certain benefits, a bit of tweaking. And one thing that was interesting was a proposal that giving the employer an option to instead of paying overtime pay, to replacing it with time off in lieu, which I think a lot of international employers would really like to do. But we'll have to see. We'll have to see what comes through. I think we will get some amendments in this year, but let's see when they come.
We've talked a lot about, the UAE has also introduced a lot of new amendments recently, and since the pandemic, we've talked a lot about the working week, and recently the big announcement in the UAE of the change of the working week, as well as a 4.5-day work week for government employees. Do you expect Saudi Arabia, and I know that's a bit of a guessing game, but you're in the know, would you expect Saudi to follow suit on the working week? And more importantly, when do you believe that there would, or are there currently regulations or amendments that make it compulsory for private sector employees to give their employees a 1 or 2 day weekend at the moment?
So at the moment, the requirement is you can, as an employer, operate a 6-day work week. You have to give people 1 day off a week. Now, interestingly, and this is, the labor law, the last amendments were in 2015, and so this has been the case for a long time. Interestingly, the labor law says the day off would be Friday, but it also says that an employer and employee can agree another day off. So from a legal perspective, the ability is there. And we do see banks using this. Traders, who are based in the kingdom will be asked to work on Friday because the markets are open. However, my personal view is that I don't think it will be an official change of work week in the way that the UAE has changed. I don't think that will happen in Saudi Arabia in the short to medium term. I personally don't see it, but many may. I don't know.
I'm just checking questions that we're receiving. Imtinan is saying, we read some announcement on upcoming remote work regulation. How would this impact Saudization, considering that remote work applies to Saudis only?
That is correct. I have actually only today received the copy of the ministerial decision. So yes, that's very true. There has been this ministerial decision about remote working and to enable remote working. How would it affect? Well, I mean, it should make it easier, I would say, to meet Saudization. The cynic, there has, let's all be honest, there has historically been this sort of, well, we employ people because we have to, they don't really do very much for us. I genuinely, hand on heart, think a lot of that has been purged for many companies. I used to get told by a lot of companies that, they had the kind of what they called sleeping employee. Another term I've heard is shadow employee. But, with the new compliance regime in the system, this is really, it's not possible. The Ministry of HR was aware, and there's now a specific fine. If you've got false Saudization, you can be fined 20,000 riyals for every person that you've got like this. And so I think a lot of this has been purged. Now, with remote working, you might be able, you should be able to increase your Saudization, just because, for example, sometimes you might increase the number of women you employ, and so on. So it's a good thing. I don't think it's gonna be a bad thing.
Yeah, it's interesting to see the UAE and Saudi Arabia both at the same time. I mean, it is a difficult time economically and socially. It has been for the past couple of years. Saudi Arabia has probably been more badly hit with the oil. But it's interesting to see both countries introduce new regulations and updates and take quite different strategies, really, when it comes to talent, when it comes to how things are done. Is there anything else that you think, I mean, I saw a lot of the questions from attendees that were submitted prior to the session had to do with notice period and termination, which we've kind of touched upon. I saw quite a few questions on paid leave, unpaid leave, but I think these are all kind of specific questions. The rest, I think we've addressed it. Is there anything that you think we haven't addressed yet that is worth highlighting at this point?
I think hmm?
Go ahead, go ahead.
I think interestingly, we are seeing the ministry doing well, having a little bit of focus on health and safety, and that is interesting because I think the other GCC countries are maybe not as active in this area, and so we have seen, you know, regulations about health and safety officers being a Saudized function, regulations about occupational health and safety, and then towards the end of 21, in October, November, the ministry launched a portal where individuals can report health and safety issues directly to the ministry. So that's quite interesting. And I think it's interesting, well, one, this move to digitization and these portals, the ministry has a portal for everything. And they're kind of all working out how they function and so on. There are glitches, but you know, they are facilitating, I think, a lot of communication and documents and stuff. And I think the way that the ministry is now engaging, especially with Saudi employees, is very interesting. You know, through Twitter, through these portals, through these kind of direct communications. And you know, that's interesting in itself, and it'll be interesting to see how the ministry starts using the information they gain to maybe you know, introduce more regulations and so on.
A few last questions. So Caroline's asking, where can we access the remote work decision that was just announced? Where can this be found?
Do you know what? I am going to be generous. Share it with you. I just need to save it on my system and then I can share it with you guys.
Amazing. Well, if not here in the chat, we'll make sure that we send it to you in the post-session email that will be sent to you. Do you expect to see the rest of Saudi Arabia opening up, or do you think that for now this will be kind of more focused on Riyadh and Jeddah? Manisha is asking.
In terms of the government focus type thing. Yeah, I think it will be. I mean, in Vision 2030, there is the goal setting of having three what are called or described as global cities, and obviously, you know, Riyadh because it's the heart of the government, Jeddah because it's historically, you know, commercial capital. I think the focus is going to be on those two for a very long time. The Eastern province is feeling a little bit left out these days, I think. But, you know, it's the center of the oil industry, so I guess you know, it can afford. You know, the focus is I think going to be on Riyadh and Jeddah, and obviously, you know, in December there was the big announcement about the redevelopment of Jeddah and a 75 billion investment that the government is going to make over in 3 stages over 7 years.
Do we expect more regulations about dual employment? We haven't touched upon that.
I think we will have more. Certainly, my experience is that in the past 2 to 3 years, we've had a lot more people who have dual employment in the UAE and in Saudi. And I think actually, probably the UAE, there'll be less dual employment because of this remote work visa. So, I mean, I think yes, I think it'll increase. The remote work visa, hopefully for some situations, you might not need to keep the work visa going. But yeah, I think there will be a bit more of it, yes.
Sorry, I'm reading questions at the same time. Do we expect new economic zones and new regulations to be developed for the mega projects or the Giga projects such as NEOM, King Abdullah Financial District, etc.?
So I think there has been. I think the short answer to that is yes. I think what'll happen. Well, there is a free zone. Oops, sorry. What happened? Sorry. I mean, there has been a new free zone set up that is next to the airport in Riyadh. And so that's the sort of first proper free zone. It has only just set up, so I think they're still trying to figure out the kind of rules of it and so on. And then with the Giga projects, some of them are going to start being the sort of company that's owned by the government that's running them. They will start now being rebranded as authorities. So NEOM will become NEOM Authority. Al-Ula Royal Commission might become Al-Ula Authority. So we're going to start seeing that happen with the Giga projects. And there should be more free zones. The government has said that they will introduce more free zones in the same sense of free zones like the UAE.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we haven't seen it yet, but it wouldn't be surprising considering the amount of SMEs that are being founded in Saudi Arabia, that it's always been a big contributor and the focus on innovation. But it will be something for us to keep an eye on, and definitely very likely bring you back in a couple months to discuss the latest development. I guess the big concern every time that we talk about, in particular, when we talk about Saudization, but even Emiratization to a large extent, is employers and expats being worried about their own roles, right? So it's an economy that's been built upon bringing expertise and knowledge from outside into the country to whilst that expertise perhaps was being built in the country, but it just wasn't ready. But there is a time when it's going to catch up, and most of the roles will be Saudized or Emiratized. What can organizations do you think, to retain that diversity? And do you see that countries in the region are still trying to maintain that expats living and spending in the country?
That's a really interesting point. I think that whilst the government, this is in Saudi or the UAE, but in Saudi, obviously, like we've been talking, Saudization is a huge focus. Parallel to that, the government did launch and has had for a couple of years the premium residency campaign, and I know that the government wants to, they want to promote it. So they do, alongside promoting Saudization, they do have this ambition to attract, the brightest and the best, which means that they still have to be attractive for non-Saudis. So they have this premium residency. They do want to widen it out and promote it to more people. And they recently, there was a grant of citizenship to, I think it was 10 worthy individuals who'd been in the kingdom for years and years and kind of built professional careers and contributed. So it's a balancing act, I think. I think there's definitely a place for expatriate workers. There will always be. And it's just a delicate balance, I think, of trying to transfer skills. So it's trying to upskill a kind of local population, but there's always going to be a place for expatriate workers, I think.
Yeah. All right, so I think we're coming to the end of our session. I know we started late, but we've tried to catch up with the time. If you have any further questions, please drop them in the chat. We might be able to take one or two, but in the meantime, thank you everybody for joining us. As always, thank you, Sarah, for being here and taking all of our questions, even though these sessions tend to go left, right, and center. And thank you for being so generous and sharing a few things with us. I have seen a few comments around the lack of availability of documents and legal documents in English. I think that's an issue that we do see a lot as well in the UAE. Even the fact that there is no legal journal, that we have to rely on law firms to pick up cases and translate it for us. So I think that is something tricky, but I know that you've always recommended for people to go on the government website. I can also recommend the Clyde Co website, which usually has great podcasts and articles that kind of break things down a little after it's come out. Clyde Co and the CIPD are partnering for short courses. So we have been working in collaboration together for many years now, and we do have a UAE Labour Law short course, which is delivered entirely virtually and includes all of the latest development, which is coming up in March. and Saudi Labour Law course, which is available both in English and in Arabic, coming up later this year. So do let us know if you're interested. We'll send you the recording, and of course, do connect with us on CIPD.ae or on social media. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.